Radio reconnaissance and the lessons of history. I would like to talk about the major problem in the history of Russia, the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, and the issue closely connected with it, information security. Why is this subject still important for us? Because it defines the position of the country in a most essential area, its integrity and sovereignty. Let's turn to history. On June 22, 1941, Germany attacked the USSR, and the Great Patriotic War began. It brought huge losses to the Red Army. More than 4 million people were killed in the first months of the war. The Red Army sustained enormous losses of arms and equipment. Plants were destroyed. Usually, Soviet history explains this as an unexpected invasion of our country by the German army. But why was it unexpected? Many archival documents and protocols of Nuremberg interrogation of the chief commanders of the German army are available today. So we cannot only compare the number of armies, tanks, and planes of the Soviet Union and Germany at the very beginning of the war, but also analyze the administration and management principles in the Soviet and German armies. It is well known that usually, in order to control army activities, commanders give orders and transfer commands and operations reports via various communication lines in encrypted form. However, we know very little about encrypted communication of the Red Army on the eve of the Great Patriotic War. Therefore, we'll refer to some historical documents. During interrogations after the end of the war, the Chief of the Army, Staff General Franz Halder, said that before the war with the USSR, Germany had received extremely important information about the activity of the Red Army from radio interception and decryption of the Soviet correspondence. It means that information security level of the Red Army was very low. The repressions in 1937 actually decapitated cryptography in Russia. The special department at OGPU NKVD, headed by Gleb Boki, was closed down. The automated encryption means in the Soviet Union just before the war were ineffective. How did decoding and radio reconnaissance service function in the USSR? It is known from archival documents that radio reconnaissance service of the Northern Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, and military counterintelligence in the Far East were very active. The Soviet cryptographers managed to decrypt the messages of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and the Japanese army. That is why the Soviet government, primarily Joseph Stalin, had exact information about the situation in the Far East and Japan, the country which was considered to be our potential enemy. Joseph Stalin is often criticized for not trusting the Secret Service reports which gave the exact dates of the German assault on the Soviet Union. At that time, many heads of states, including Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Adolf Hitler, didn't make any serious political decisions after they had received intelligence reports, until this data was verified by the decoded materials of radio reconnaissance from important sources of the enemy, first of all from the ministries of foreign affairs and military agencies of the potential enemies. If we refer to the documents submitted to Stalin by Philippe Golikov, the chief of the main intelligence directorate of the Red Army, we'll be surprised to find out that they didn't contain any reports on radio interception and decryption of the German cryptographic systems, which were used by the German armies stationed near the western borders of the USSR. How can we explain this fact? Special Purpose Detachments, OSNAs, which were a part of the main intelligence directorate of the Red Army, operated in the Western Special Military District. What did OSNAs do before the war? As it turned out, OSNA's divisions were not allowed to supervise the German radio communication of Wehrmacht. It supervised only the communication systems of the Red Army in order to detect potential enemies in the ranks of the Red Army. those who could be working for the German secret services. Obviously, Joseph Stalin was most of all afraid that the commanders in his army could betray him. Therefore, the Oznaz radio control divisions had no opportunity to inform military reconnaissance party of the Red Army about the dangerous concentration of the German armies near the western borders of the USSR, and Joseph Stalin couldn't define correctly the date when the war with Germany would begin. Moreover, reports are published about strange orders which Soviet military commanders had received just before the war. For example, they received ciphered messages with orders to remove arms from the fighters deployed along the Soviet western border. Now it's clear that those messages were falsified by German secret services. So a real information war was waged against the Soviet Union before the Great Patriotic War. It is important to mention here that at the very beginning of the war, the Germans captured a large number of manual coding equipment of the Red Army, which was the basis of encoded communication in the USSR. There were only few automated systems for enciphering in the USSR, and they were not reliable. There was also another serious problem which had to be urgently solved. It was necessary to replace the encoding systems seized and compromised by the Germans, but that could take a lot of time. New manual coding documents and keys for them had to be printed and dispatched to their destination points. It is a very labor-intensive task even now, but in those days, printing equipment was much slower. For example, when a British military ship was captured by the Germans, who then gained access to English cryptographic documentation, it took England 3 months to replace the compromised codes. If we take into consideration the fact that the development level of polygraphy in Russia was lower than in England, we can assume that it would take the Soviet military from 4 to 5 months to recover the compromised cryptographic documentation. If we add these 4 to 5 months to the start date of the war between the USSR and Germany, we can describe the events in the following way. During the fight for Moscow, all Soviet compromised codes were replaced with the new ones. As a result, the German radio reconnaissance couldn't read the Red Army codes anymore. In his testimony during the interrogation on June 17, 1945, Chief of the Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command of the German Armed Forces, the Colonel General Jodl, confirmed the great bulk of military information about the course of the war, about 90%, were the materials of radio reconnaissance and interrogations of prisoners of war. Radio reconnaissance, both active interception and decoding, played a special role at the very beginning of the war. German intelligence service had precise information about most of the movements of the Red Army. It is why it was defeated during the first months of the war. Moreover, the German secret services organized the so-called radio games. As a result, commanders received forged messages with orders that were supposed to be from the high command of the Red Army. These messages ordered the commanders to direct their military divisions to the locations where the enemy attacked and destroyed them. The United States and Great Britain drew the correct conclusion from the history of World War II. Information security is a decisive factor for victory in modern wars. The Soviet Union drew another conclusion after the end of the war and increased the production of tanks, artillery, and planes. Naturally, nobody denies that it is necessary to have enough military equipment, but it is impossible to win modern wars if reliable, secure, that is encrypted, communication systems are not used to command the troops. Russia has to remember the bloody lesson they learned during the Great Patriotic War to avoid this mistake in the future.